All right, guys. So Johnny got his gun, chapter 18. When he finally forced his mind away from thoughts of Christmas, of Merry Christmas, he began to tap once more. Only this time he tapped firmly with vigor, full of hope and confidence, for he saw that this lovely new nurse, was thinking as hard as he was, and of the same thing. He knew as plainly as if she had told him that she was determined to batter down the silence which stood between him as a dead man and him as a live man. Since she had already thought of a way to speak to him, he knew that she would pay attention when he tried to speak to her. The others had been too busy or too tired or else not bright enough to see what he was doing. They had taken his tapping as a nervous habit, as a disease, as the whim of a child, as a symptom of insanity, as anything but what it really was, as anything but a cry from the darkness, a voice from the dead, a wail in the silence for friendship and someone to talk to. But the new nurse would understand and help him. He tapped very carefully, very slowly, to show her that he had a method in what he was doing. Just as she had repeated the design of the letter M on his chest over and over again, so he now tapped his distress signal back to her, but slowly, so slowly. Dot, 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 dot. SOS, help. Over and over again he repeated it. Once in a while he would stop at the completion of the signal. That was his question mark, just as her pauses had been question marks. He would stop and try to make all that was visible of him, his hair and half his forehead above the mask, take on an air of expectancy. Then when he received no sign from her, he would do it again. And all the while he tapped, he was conscious of her near him, watching and thinking. After a long period of waiting and watching and thinking, she began to do things. She did them very deliberately, so deliberately that even her movements seemed thoughtful. First she slipped the urinal under the covers, touching it against his body so that he could recognize it. He shook his head, she shook the urinal away and slipped the bedpan against him. He shook his head, she took the bedpan away. There was no hesitation between her movements now. It seemed that she had each move figured out before she finished the last one. She was working skillfully and intelligently to eliminate all possible causes for his tapping, one by one with no pauses in between. He knew that during the time she had stood beside him watching and thinking, she had made up her mind to a plan and now was putting it into effect, with as little nonsense as possible. She took the blanket off him, leaving him with only a sheet for covering. He shook his head, she put the blanket back and threw another one over it to give him more covers than before. He shook his head, he had stopped tapping now, waiting alertly until she was through with her plan. She took the covers off him entirely and adjusted the position of the breathing tube in his throat. He shook his head, she patted the bandage over the hole in his side. He shook his head and marveled that he had the sense left to do it because he was so charged with excitement that he could scarcely think. She lifted the nightshirt that covered him and began gently to rub his body. He shook his head, she threw the covers over him again and moved toward the head of the bed. She rubbed his forehead soothingly, he shook his head, she smoothed his hair back and scratched his scalp and massaged it with her knuckles. He shook his head, she loosened the cord that held the mask over his face. He shook his head, she lifted the mask up and fanned it gently to let the air in and be sure it wasn't sticking. He shook his head, she replaced the bandage and stopped everything. He could feel her standing beside the head of the bed looking down at him attentively, as alert and eager as he was himself. She had done everything she could think of, and now she was standing there quietly as if to say, "It's your turn now. Please try hard to tell me and I will try hard to understand." He began to tap again. It seemed to him that he stopped breathing. It seemed that his heart stopped and the blood in his body turned solid. It seemed that the only living, moving thing in the whole world was his head as it tapped, tapped, tapped against his pillow. He knew it was now or never. There was no good in fooling himself now. This minute, this instant, this very second, everything was about to be decided. Never again would he have a nurse such as this one. She might turn and walk out of the room in 5 minutes and never return. When she walked away, she would carry his life with her. She would carry madness and loneliness and all his godforsaken silent screams. And she would never know it. She would never hear the screams. She would simply go, and ever after he would be forgotten. She was loneliness and friendship. She was life and death. And she stood now waiting quietly for him to tell her what he wanted. While he tapped, he was praying in his heart. He had never paid much attention to praying before. But now he was doing it, saying, "Oh, please, God, make her understand what I'm trying to tell her. I've been alone so long, God, I've been here for years and years, suffocating, smothering, dead while alive like a man who has been buried in a casket deep in the ground and awakens and screams, I'm alive. I'm alive, I'm alive, let me out. Open the lid, dig away the dirt, please, merciful Christ, help me, only there's no one to hear him. And so he's dead. I know you're very busy, God. I know there are millions of people praying to you every minute, every hour for something they need. I know there are a lot of important people who are after you for big things that are all tied up with nations and continents and maybe even the whole world. I know all these things, God. I don't blame you if you get behind on your orders. Nobody's perfect, but what I want is such a little thing. If I were asking you for something big, something like $1 million or a private yacht or a skyscraper, I can understand if I didn't get it because there are only too many dollars and so many yachts and so many skyscrapers. But I only want you should take a tiny little idea that is in my mind and put it into her mind, 2, maybe 3 feet away. That's all I want, God. The idea is so small, so light that a hummingbird could carry it, a moth, a mayfly, the breath of air that comes from the mouth of a baby. It won't take any time, and it means I can't tell you what to me. Honestly, I wouldn't ask you, God, only this is such a little thing. It's such a little thing. He felt her finger against his forehead. He nodded. He felt her finger tap 4 times against his forehead. That is the letter H, he thought, only she doesn't know it. She's got no idea. She just keeps tapping, there to test if that's what I want. He nodded. He nodded so hard his neck ached and his head seemed to whirl. He nodded so hard the whole bed shook. Oh, thank you, God, he thought. She got it. You put the idea where I asked you. She got it. You put the idea where I asked you should. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. He felt her hand pressed against his forehead reassuringly for just a minute, then he got the rapidly receding vibrations of her footsteps going away. He knew she was running from the room to tell them. The door slammed behind her. The sound quivered against his bed springs like an electric shock. She was gone. He lay back surprised to find how exhausted he was. It was like he had worked 3 nights in a row at the bakery during the summer when he couldn't get any sleep in the daytime. The breath was gone out of him and his head throbbed and every muscle in his body was sore. Yet inside he was all confetti and high-flying flags and double-time band music that marched up and up straight into the face of the sun. He had done it. He had succeeded. The thing was accomplished, and even though he lay perfectly still, perfectly exhausted, it seemed he could see the whole world lying below him. There was no telling it. There was no thinking it. There was no imagining it. He was so happy. It was as if all the people in the world, the whole 2 billion of them, had been against him, pushing the lid of the coffin down on him, tamping the dirt solid against the lid, rearing great stones above the dirt to keep him in the earth. Yet he had risen, he had lifted the lid, he had thrown away the dirt, he had tossed the granite aside like a snowball, and now he was above the surface. He was standing in the air. He was leaping with every step miles above the earth. He was like nobody else who had ever lived. He had done so much, he was like God. The doctors who brought their friends in to see him would no longer say, here is a man who has lived without arms, legs, ears, eyes, nose, mouth. Isn't it wonderful? They would say, here is a man who can think. Here is a man who lay in his bed with only a cut of meat to hold him together, and yet he thought of a way to talk. Listen to him speak. You see, his mind is unaffected. He speaks like you and me. He is a person. He has identity. He is part of the world. And he is part of the world only because he, all by himself, with perhaps the aid of a prayer and a God, figured out a way to speak. Look at him, and then let us ask you if this isn't even more wonderful than all the splendid operations we have performed upon his stump. He knew now that he had never been really happy in his whole life. There had been times when he had thought he was happy, but none of them were like this. There was a time when all year long he had wanted an erector set, and when at Christmas time he got it. That was probably as happy as he had ever been while he was a kid. There was a time when Corinne told him that she loved him, and that was as happy as he had ever been up to the time the shell exploded and blew him out of the world. But this happiness, this new wild frantic happiness, was greater than anything he could conceive. It was a thing so absolute, so towering, so out of this world that it hit him almost like delirium. His legs that were smashed and gone up and danced. His arms that were rotted, these 5, 6, 7 years, swung fantastically free at his sides to keep time with the dance. The eyes that they had taken from him looked up from whatever garbage heap they had been consigned to and saw all the beauties of the world. The ears that were shattered and full of silence rang suddenly with music. The mouth that had been hacked away from his face and now was filled with dust returned to sing. Because he had done it, he had accomplished the impossible. He had spoken to them like God out of a cloud, out of a thick cloud, and now he was floating on top of the cloud and was a man again. And the nurse, He could imagine her running through the halls. He could hear her clattering like a noisy ghost through the halls of death. He could feel her running from ward to ward, from the ward of the cripples to the ward of the deaf men, to the ward of the blind men, to the ward of the voiceless men, summoning all the people of the hospital, screaming out to them the news of the wonder that had happened. He could hear her voice as she told them that up in a little room away from the rest of the hospital, a lid had been lifted from a coffin, a stone had been rolled away from a tomb, and a dead man was tapping and talking. Never before in the world had the dead spoken, never since Lazarus, and Lazarus didn't say anything. Now he would tell them everything. He would speak from the dead. He would talk for the dead. He would tell all the secrets of the dead. And while he thought of what he would tell them, the nurse was running through wards and corridors, from floor to floor, from basement to attic, all through that great place from which so many dead had gone. She was trumpeting through the hospital like the angel Gabriel, telling them to come and to listen to the voice of the dead. While he waited for all the people she had summoned to come to him, he could feel their presence as an actor must feel the presence of 1,000 people in that moment before the curtain goes up. He could feel the vibrations of their footsteps, dozens of them, as they thronged into his room. He could feel his bed jostled back and forth as they pressed against it in their eagerness. The springs of his bed seemed to send up a constant low hum as his guests shifted for positions to get a better view of the dead man who was speaking. The temperature of the room became so much warmer that he could almost feel the heat of their masked bodies against the skin of his neck and the half of his forehead that was naked above the mask. Then the door opened. He felt the vibration of a footstep, a light one, the nurse's footstep. He strained to feel the rest. Then came the vibrations of another footstep, this one heavier, belonging to a man. He waited for the rest. He waited for the hum of his bed springs, but everything was quiet. Everything was still. There was no one in the room for the great thing that was about to happen except him and his nurse and his heavy-footed stranger. And this heavy-footed stranger. No one at all but the three of them. He felt an odd pang of disappointment that they should consider such a great event so lightly. And then he remembered the thing that was even more important than crowds. He lay there stiff, quiet, more like a dead man than he had ever been before. He lay there waiting to receive his response. A finger came out of the darkness, a finger so enormous that it shattered against his forehead like the crash of a pile driver. It echoed inside his brain like thunder in a cave. The finger began to tap. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? Let me show you how it looks. What do you want? What do you want? That's the end of that chapter. Peace.